Okay, I'm Keegan Siebenaler, and welcome to the first episode of the ShelterWF podcast. I'm here with ShelterWF board member and co-founder Nathan Dugan. Nathan, welcome.
Thank you, Keegan. It's good to be here.
So you are the executive director of Livable Flathead. Could you describe what that is and how it differs from ShelterWF?
I am, yeah. So we work to direct growth in the Flathead Valley proactively using evidence-based policies to foster economic opportunities, interconnected transportation, and abundant housing options for all. So we work valley-wide, primarily right now in the cities of Columbia Falls, Kalispell, and Whitefish, working on housing and transportation issues kind of across the valley, doing research, educating the public and policymakers, and kind of tracking progress, I guess, on the back end. So we recently started a Strong Towns local conversation here in the Flathead Valley as Livable Flathead. And if you haven't heard of Strong Towns before, definitely check them out at strongtowns.org. A couple things about Strong Towns as an organization. They exist to help people take practical action where they have the most power on their block, in their neighborhood, and at City Hall. They say, and I think that we agree with this, the way we build our cities and towns is fundamentally broken. And this is especially true when it comes to housing, which is why we are discussing escaping the housing trap, the Strong Towns response to the housing crisis on today's episode of the podcast.
Yeah, I wanted to have you on not only because you're one of the only other people working in housing full-time in the Valley, but also because I think as someone else who's gone through numerous rounds of seeing what the city planning process is like, you do get to a point where every time we're driving around the valley, we are kind of inherently talking about the systems that govern it.
So what is the housing trap?
In the simplest form, it's basically that we need housing prices to fall, but we can't afford to let them fall. What this book points out is that we have two incoherent conversations around housing. The first is that we need a strong housing market. And what strong housing market is code for is we need housing prices to continue to rise as quickly as possible. And then the second conversation we have is that the price of housing is unbearably high for so many people. And the fact that those two things are both said with a straight face by the same people is the housing trap. It's this trap where we need prices to go down, but also if prices go down, everything collapses.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the common wisdom in the industry, I guess, was that your house shouldn't be an investment, or you shouldn't think of it that way, because basically inflation is going to eat up all of the profits that you earn. And as we've seen in recent decades, and especially since the pandemic, those prices have gotten entirely out of whack. And once you see $1 million price tag on your home, you don't really want to give that up easily.
There's a stat somewhere deeper in this book that says the amount of wealth generated by appreciation of real estate is greater than the amount of wealth generated by labor in the past 10 years. So more money in the United States is created simply by the appreciation of land cost than through like actual economic activity. And it's easy to step back and say that's not a good way for an economy to function. Like that's not going to go well in the long term. I will say that post-COVID, for example, in a place like the Flathead Valley, might be the first time that a lot of people saw that there was a problem with the system. That is the consequence of like 100 years of economic policy in the United States. So to go through the first part of the book, it basically is talking about the financial basis of the housing crisis.
Well, so how did we get to a place where housing is so expensive, and how do we get to a place where it rose so much? The housing market is a market after all, and so the market is just doing what the market should do, right?
Well, I think the difference is that housing is now primarily a financial instrument, and that just doesn't really work with it when it's like a basic good that everyone needs to survive. So they have a quote in here where they say the primary purpose of a house today isn't to provide shelter. That is such an old-fashioned, quaint way to think about housing. No, the primary purpose of a house is to create a piece of mortgage paper, a financial instrument that can be brokered, transferred, bundled, securitized, hypothecated, traded, collateralized, and gambled with. And that apparatus develops through individual policies over the course of 100 years that each make sense in narrow context. Okay, so you have the GI Bill, you're subsidizing mortgages there. You're building up different government apparatuses, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and all of these government ways in which we support individual mortgages And what that does is we eventually started layering on top of each other different ways in which a guaranteed mortgage given to anyone, regardless of income, is the foundation of pensions. It's the foundation of like most safe investments in the American economy. And because of that, there is infinite demand for new mortgages and for new development in ways that create really perverse incentives for the type of development that actually houses people.
Yeah, so I guess I understand that housing and real estate has become this huge asset class recently, and maybe we'll get into this later in the book. But I guess, if everybody has a house, everybody that needs a house has a house. How has it gotten to the point where it appreciates so quickly and so much better than even the stock market, at least in recent years? Because that's ultimately like what makes people want to continue to invest in real estate is that they're getting more money than they are somewhere else. Did the book talk about that at all?
I think it's sort of a circular answer, which is that housing appreciates so much in value and appreciates so quickly because we can't have that not be the case. We've put too much of our society onto that bet. And I say that because there's many, many stories throughout the book where they talk about, in the 70s, home prices start to go down, and then all the savings and loans start to go bankrupt. And so there's laws passed and reforms that like guarantee all these loans and have a government enterprise buy them like below market rate. And so the first reason why it appreciates so fast is that we have, every time it doesn't start to appreciate fast, it is the singular goal of the United States government to stop that decline. And so like the most prescient example of this is the 2008 financial crisis, which really is a housing crisis, right? It's about subprime mortgages. And what you get is a situation where home prices decrease for a while and that bubble bursts. But we put in a ton of new levers that ensured, or at least tried to ensure, that those home prices wouldn't do that again. I put a chart in here, the home price index from 1945 to now.
Yeah, let's go over that.
If it was a bubble in 2008, I don't know what it is now, but it's very challenging to just assume that that is the natural state of the housing market. And so that gets to the second reason, which is if we need housing prices to go up, and we need them to go up very, very quickly, then since about the 1980s, we have chronically underbuilt housing. And so now we're in a massive shortage of supply, which is going to drive up prices.
Yeah, so who benefits from those prices going up, and who is impacted negatively, I guess, by those prices going up?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people that are narrowly benefited in the here and now. I don't think most people or society at large benefits in the long term from housing being unaffordable and unavailable to so many people. Who narrowly benefits is local governments, who can charge lower tax rates on higher property values.
But that's just like a political expediency thing, because if you know strong towns at all, you know that the revenues that local governments typically bring in from property taxes aren't enough to cover their liabilities. So replacing sewer infrastructure, water infrastructure, roads, they can't cover it. And so they have to keep growing and growing and growing to cover liabilities from 20 or 30 years ago.
Well, so that's what I mean when I say who benefits. It's like if you are in a Ponzi scheme, which most local governments are in terms of their infrastructure costs right now, the best thing to do when you're already in a Ponzi scheme is keep getting new people to come into the Ponzi scheme.
Yep.
So if you're a local government right now and you've already built up an apparatus where all of your financial stability is dependent on new greenfield development on the edge of your city, then you, in the short term, benefit from that.
Which is great until the auto plant closes or the steel mill closes. And that's kind of what we saw happen throughout the Midwest.
Totally. Yeah. The entire financial system that's built on the back of this, so like banks and mortgage companies and pensions and those sorts of things, developers and contractors to some extent, if they're able to like charge as much as they can for housing, and then existing homeowners, which are maybe the like biggest group of people that benefits. And all of those are quite powerful forces in society. Like we're describing a majority of financial and political power in that group. And on the other side, there's a quote here: line up all these constituencies on one side of the influence ledger. Who sits on the other side? Who doesn't benefit from appreciating home values? Renters, first-time home buyers, especially young people and those without savings or equity to trade in, and the poor. It hardly needs to be said that these are less influential constituencies. So it's funny reading that and being involved in like housing and whitefish, where this is exactly what we see.
Mm-hmm.
The people that show up to meetings in Whitefish, and it's not just Whitefish, it's basically every town in the nation, have a lot to gain by housing remaining expensive or by housing prices appreciating. And they may not say that directly. They may say things like, oh, I'm protecting the character of the neighborhood, or oh, I'm protecting property values. But what it means is that this system can't change. And the people that are harmed often aren't in that room.
Yeah, and more often than not, the people that are making those decisions are also homeowners in the community. You know, in a lot of ways, these local races in towns across the country are kind of popularity contests. And so if you're a renter, you're probably already at a disadvantage. And if you're a renter, especially in a constrained market, like most of Western Montana has been for the last 5 or 6 years, you don't know if you're going to be able to be living in that place if your landlord raises your rent. And so you may not consider running for office in that case. And so, yeah, you get a system where most of the people engaging with it from the public side and most of the people making the decisions fit a specific class of person and a specific interest. And it is hard for that system to make decisions that are in the best interest of the entire community.
I thought the entire first section of this book, kind of describing the financial arrangement that the housing market has gone through, was super useful and pretty accurate. This quote really caught me, kind of summing up where we are now, post 2008. A financial bubble is by definition unsustainable. A post-bubble recovery in the housing market, one that restores it to unsustainable levels, feels like madness. It is the kind of approach a society would pursue only if there is no other choice. The post-crash recreation of the 2000s bubble demonstrates just how dependent on housing the American economy is. Mortgage-backed securities still sit at the heart of the banking system. The origination, bundling, and trading of mortgages remains a major source of income for the financial sector. A threat to the housing market, therefore, is a threat to the entire economy. I guess the challenge is, even like, this is common with kind of a lot of these policy books, is that it spends a lot of time on the problem, and then it spends a few chapters at the end being like, this is how we solve it. And I thought that this book had really good solutions for kind of how we can do bottom-up development, you know, how we can reform zoning laws, like how local governments can support like small-scale developers in more meaningful ways. What I don't think this book did a great job of is reckoning with the significance of the problems that it's introduced in the first half of this book. You know, there's a passage late in this book where it basically says we should commit to moderating the rate of growth of the housing market as like cities and as communities. And that's like a great idea, but I don't think it lines up against all the forces that it put together in the first half of this book that are like hell bent on stopping that from happening. I mean, in your mind, how do you resolve that tension when you're thinking about how we create more affordable housing?
I think that that's fine if your city has moderate pressure to grow. I think that we need our cities to be responsive. The thing that increases housing costs the most is what we saw happen all throughout Montana when demand goes through the roof and the system is not ready to build to accommodate that. And that's, I guess, where we get into part 2 of the book that talks about zoning. And you know, what we saw in Montana was a lot of cities that had zoning codes that weren't able to match a period of high demand, which caused housing prices to kind of double overnight. And if cities had zoning codes that would have allowed that demand when it came to have been accommodated more easily, then we may not be in the situation that we're in right now. But yeah, what is zoning?
So part 2 of this book is about zoning. The thesis of this section of the book is that cities are kind of inherently complex ecosystems. You are trying to aggregate the preferences of everybody who lives in the city, everybody who works in the city, everybody who travels there or interacts with it in any way, and trying to plan that from the top down, trying to like look at a map and color it different colors and say, this is where housing should go, and this is the type of housing that should go there, and these are the people that should be able to live there. I think it's worth addressing like why zoning fails to create useful cities. And that's like a big question. And actually, that's something I want to address throughout this entire podcast, because I think you can come at that question from about 30 different ways. But one of the main points that this book makes is that the complexity of cities means that no central planner will be able to determine everyone's preferences perfectly forever. And so Montana is a great example of that, where you might be able to say, like, in 2019, the Flathead Valley was like doing okay in terms of matching the supply of housing to the demand for it. I don't think it actually was, but it wasn't a 5-alarm fire. But then COVID happens and people's preferences shift and remote work becomes way more valuable. And a lot of people want to move to Montana. And then the entire system collapses. And when you have such rigid laws in place governing literally every square foot of our country, then massive shifts in demand that happen all the time, and even small shifts in demand that happen within a neighborhood or within a city or within a region that also happen all the time, there's just no flexibility there. And so when a system is very rigid, like zoning, it's also very brittle. And the way in which that fails is very predictable. By contrast, what this book puts forward is that we need to like embrace the complexity of cities. We need to embrace the fact that neighborhoods are going to change, and we need to allow that because that's what's going to serve that neighborhood the best. You know, this book uses some like kind of woo-woo hippie like biomimicry stuff where they're basically saying like an ecosystem is successful when it's diverse and when stuff can change and grow and decay, and like there's kind of this natural process of evolution.
And what this gets to the point that it's illegal basically to build the most beloved parts of many cities nowadays.
I think it's really funny in Whitefish where the downtown core and the avenues are two areas that are kind of the most beloved by most people in Whitefish and are not replicated in almost any other zoning throughout the city. And so just understanding that basic fact of the neighborhoods that were created before zoning codes came in are the most beloved. And I also think one thing this book points out really well is that zoning codes were not created because a bunch of people around the country in individual cities decided that they wanted them. There's this pernicious lie that zoning means local control, that it emerged out of people wanting more order in their neighborhoods. And in reality, the federal government tied transportation funds and mortgage-backed insurance and a ton of incentives to cities adopting building codes. Zoning codes and the way city planning happens in the United States in the past 50 years was created by a top-down process that was decided by a few people in positions of power.
And then it was just copied across the country, which is the easiest thing to do if you're a city employee, especially an overworked city employee, is like you just copy what the city next door did.
Right. And so like that means that if we're going to reevaluate if zoning is actually useful, then acting like zoning codes were like ordained from individual community members is just wrong. Historically, we've been talking about in Montana our fire codes and how we have one fire code for single family homes and another fire code for apartments. And the fire code for apartments is like much, much, much more strict. And I see how that can make some like vague sense of like, oh, there's more people in this building, so we should be like more careful the entire building doesn't burn down. But if you actually look in the fire code, there's a lot of stuff that simply increases the cost of housing for like very negligible benefit in terms of fire safety. And we've been talking about that as like a potential regulatory reform that we can do in the state of Montana. And so this quote from the book I thought was really prescient, where they got a quote from the National Housing Association, which like wrote original zoning codes. Vaylor recommended fire codes for this because zoning legislation will no doubt be fought strenuously and perhaps defeated. No one would question fire regulations. Quote, do everything possible in our laws to encourage the construction of private dwellings and even two-family dwellings, because the two-family house is the next least objectionable type, and penalize, so far as we can in our statute, multiple dwellings of any kind. If we require multiple dwellings to be fireproof and thus increase the cost of construction, we require stairs to be fireproofed even when there are only 3 families. If we require fire escapes and a host of other things, all dealing with fire protection, we are on safe grounds because that can be justified as a legitimate exercise of power. In our laws, let most of the fire provisions relate solely to multiple dwellings and allow our private houses and two-family houses to be built with no fire protection whatsoever. That's from 1910.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the same arguments that people have been making for 100 years, and I think they're just as disconnected from the facts as they are now.
Well, I mean, if you look at pre-war buildings in Manhattan, there are a ton of them with single stairs to exit and probably not the best building design or materials, and those things don't catch on fire very often, even in today's world. And new buildings, just with the techniques that they use alone and the materials, are typically much safer and not necessarily related to some of these fire ordinances, I guess, that this person's talking about, fire code things.
Yeah, I think it's also one of the toughest dynamics when you're in a housing shortage is that we are in this scenario where if we want like housing to be affordable, it has to be shitty. I was talking to someone near where I live in the Avenues, which are sort of these like core downtown neighborhoods of Whitefish. And I was chatting with them and they were saying, oh, like, did you see that this house across from us is getting remodeled? And I was like, yeah. Oh, it's such a shame. It's going to cost so much more. And on a narrow sense, that impulse that my neighbor had is really positive. Like, clearly they care about the affordability of housing. But we have locked ourselves into this situation where new supply is so hard to create that the only way that house in the Avenues will remain affordable is keeping it being some like 1915, 1940 construction that like the foundation's rotting away and it doesn't have very good fire protection and the appliances are a bit out of date. Like the only way it stays affordable is if it's kind of shitty. And I think that's just such a negative mindset that we have here. And like so unnecessary.
And zoning is kind of responsible for that. And I think the book talks about this as well, but basically there's two kind of things that you can build in most of the country, especially if you're building them at scale. Do you want to talk about what those are a little bit more?
Yeah, there are basically only two residential products being built at scale in North America today. One is the master plan suburban subdivision dominated by single family homes. The other is large-scale apartment housing, especially the quintessential 5/1 building. These are housing monocultures. They are to the mix of housing types found in traditional cities what a tree farm is to a forest. Could you explain what a 5/1 is?
Yeah, so it's just ground floor. You've got commercial area for a coffee shop, and you've got 5 floors of residential above that. And there's some data out there to suggest that is the sweet spot for the cheapest way to build things for whatever reason. Cheaper than a 5-story building or a 7-story building. So that 5/1 is kind of the sweet spot. And then people can have some commercial areas that provide amenities like groceries and coffee and that sort of thing right down below.
So this, I think, was the part of the book that I had maybe the most disagreement with is I think the authors point out correctly that 5/1s are built in lieu of kind of a lot of other missing middle housing types, like a townhome or a stacked triplex or some of these other housing types that have basically gone extinct. One of the ones that I hadn't really heard of too much is the triple decker in the Northeast. So it's basically 3 apartments stacked over each other that was like banned after it became ubiquitous and provided a lot of supply. This book was quite critical of 5/1s as this almost too perfect product that is like copy pasted across the country. I didn't find that criticism to be that valuable. Like, it is true that if the regulatory system was different, that 5/1s would be just one type of product that would fit on particular lots, and then on other lots you would have less development, and on other lots you would have more. But I don't think it makes much sense to just bemoan the ubiquity of 5/1s when the entire reason why they're ubiquitous is that zoning makes it hard to build anything else. I didn't know if you kind of had an opinion on that housing type and like whether it deserves as much criticism as this book gives it.
Well, I think that probably the 5/1 is so popular due to zoning codes or state laws that kind of legalize transit-oriented development, which allows just a higher level, higher density development on transit corridors with like a frequent bus stop every 15 minutes throughout the day or other sources of transit. And so I think that's kind of where I see those buildings a lot, is just on those big arterial corridors that have transit serving them. And I think that's probably why it is so ubiquitous. But yeah, that's just another instance, I guess, of zoning kind of forcing that thing to be built at the expense of other things like a fourplex or a cottage court in an existing neighborhood where people just don't really want to see any change.
I think one reason why ShelterWF exists is that we think the broad aims of the pro-housing movement that contains YIMBYs and pro-housing people and strong towns people deserves consideration in places like Whitefish. And a lot of times that requires kind of interpreting what people are saying because it's so much based on bigger cities. I don't think we have a 5/1 in Whitefish or the Valley more broadly.
Yeah,
like we have 4-story apartment buildings. We have stuff that sort of resembles a 5/1, but we don't really have that housing type here. And so our sort of main reforms have kind of been focused on kind of getting rid of some of the needless car dependency we have here around our housing developments, encouraging that growth inwards, and also prioritizing those missing middle housing types. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, we're doing exactly what this book recommends in terms of our advocacy.
Yeah, definitely. We won't get a 5/1 in Whitefish until we have buildings over 60 feet. So I think those typically are kind of 72 feet with how things work out. So, but yeah, I guess, do we want to touch on how zoning relates to affordability before we talk about how we go about kind of changing this and making things better for people?
The book makes an interesting point around like capital A affordable housing. So like deed restricted affordable housing subsidized by the government. And that is a very popular type of like solution to the housing crisis, even though it's not a solution at all. There's just not enough money available to subsidize the amount of housing we would need for everyone. Mm-hmm. People in Whitefish.
That's because development is far more expensive than anybody thinks that it is. We were in Boise last week and we looked at a 102 unit apartment complex that was built on city land. So I'm assuming that land was free or at least very cheap. And the cost to develop that project, which is, just a standard apartment building, I don't think there's anything especially luxury or nice about it, were $37 million, or if my math is right, like $370,000 per apartment home inside of that building. So, just it's bleak how much.
And that's 100
cost.
people.
Yep.
We have probably 20,000 people in the Flathead Valley that are cost burdened. So it's just the solution doesn't scale.
And that was affordable as well. So like the capital stack was crazy. There was a lot of subsidy money involved in that project.
Totally. I thought the point this book made with regards to that was really strong, which was that the reason why these affordable housing policies are popular is because they don't threaten the increasing cost of market rate housing at all. So it says, rarely stated openly, but many of the least affordable cities aim to create a limited stock of dedicated affordable housing without disrupting the overall upward price trajectory. Because inclusionary zoning, for example, requires developers to include below market rate units, the more expensive units are priced even higher to subsidize them. So high prices are reinforced in the name of affordability. I thought that was really strong, not because subsidized housing is bad, but because it doesn't actually challenge the problem. It doesn't address the problem really at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see that play out Whitefish day in and day out. There's a theoretical love of deed restricted housing here in town, and they're trying to keep two separate markets so that the one market continues to just skyrocket. And then the people that we need to be here to teach our kids or take care of us at the hospital or work in our restaurants really need to win the lottery effectively to kind of get a place to live, especially if they're looking to own and just be here forever.
If we could effectively bifurcate the market like that, great. The numbers just don't work out. When your subsidy needs to serve 20 to 30% of the people in your city, it is never going to do that. Those solutions become a lot more valuable when it needs to serve maybe the lowest 5% of your population in terms of income or ability to pay. They say, how can we shield vulnerable tenants from the market, and how can we bring the market price of housing down, are not opposed strategies. They must be complementary. So I think we can move on maybe to the different solutions that this book offers for how to move forward, maybe some of the ways in which they can work in Whitefish. So this book has 6 principles that say must underlie kind of how we respond to the housing crisis. They are: no neighborhood can be exempt from change. And so this basically means that all neighborhoods are works in progress. And if we're going to create better solutions, that kind of every neighborhood has to be involved in that.
I mean, it's a good principle. Certainly, there are people that buy their house and they say, like, this is the neighborhood that I chose to buy into. I don't think that most millennials get a choice in the neighborhood that they live in. For myself, certainly, it's just like, this is the house I can afford. And then, like, I actually like my neighborhood, but I also don't care if it changes a little bit when some of the older folks in the neighborhood are no longer around, right? So,
Yeah, I can't really relate because I'm a Zoomer, too young, not washed, unk. So kind of a corollary to that is that no neighborhood should experience radical change. So no neighborhood can be exempt from change, but no neighborhood should experience radical change.
yeah, I mean, that's what we see with the current systems that are in place right now. Is you get, because it's illegal to build anything basically that isn't just and nobody's doing it, a large apartment complex or single family home. You do see really significant change in neighborhoods when a 200 unit apartment complex gets built there, rather than just adding ADUs in backyards or building a fourplex or a cottage court when a house reaches its end of life and is going to get demolished anyway. So rather than just building another single family home, we put more units in the neighborhood.
We created a regulatory environment that made it impossible to build anything except large apartment buildings, and then we got really upset that all we got was large apartment buildings. Yeah. And kind of on this point, they say there should be a low bar of entry to obtaining housing. So in this part, they mention legalizing tiny homes, single resident occupancy buildings, like flop houses is what they used to be called, manufactured housing, etc. There's some really strong research basically showing that the thing that determines more than anything if you're going to be homeless is not addiction, it's not mental health, it's whether the housing market in the city that you're at has options available for people who are like on the edge of homelessness. And so enabling some of these undesirable but incredibly affordable housing types is how you address the homeless problem.
Yeah. I mean, it's the last step before somebody ends up on the street. But I would add to this too, like, in addition to these sorts of things, just having a healthy rental market is a good thing for a city to have as well, where if you need to find a place to rent, you can find a place to rent. There are enough vacancies that you don't get pushed out and that your rent doesn't skyrocket overnight. So that's often the first entry point into a community, is an apartment that you rent when you first move there or you first graduate from high school, so that you can kind of get your feet under you and decide where you would like to buy if you're in a position to do that.
Yeah, it's funny. I rent in Whitefish and I moved between a few places, and ultimately the only reason I'm able to live close to downtown Whitefish for an affordable price is I have connections. I grew up here. I know this area well. I can move back in with my mom if I need to. And that flexibility is really nice. And also, I know a lot of people who moved here later in life. They don't have their family here, and they're in a very similar financial situation to me, but they're not able to find a place to live in Whitefish. And to me, that is not a just law of nature. That is a decision that we've made about what kind of housing market we want to create.
All right, what's number 4?
Number 4 is housing must be part of a neighborhood level economic ecosystem. So one strategy that they say we can kind of insulate the housing market from the forces of the financial ecosystem more broadly is by creating kind of circular economies within ecosystems, within neighborhoods, within regions, and therefore within cities. And in this, it calls out the need for neighborhood commercial activity and mixed use building, and kind of a move away from the sort of single-use zoning that we have in a lot of places. So again, very, very needed in Whitefish. We've pushed for that really hard with limited success. But that is how you get resilient communities and neighborhoods, and how you avoid bedroom communities and places that are exclusively commercial or exclusively residential, and therefore are very subject to swings in demand that can turn those places into ghost towns really quickly.
Yeah, and Whitefish is slowly kind of becoming a place where you have to go to Kalispell to do almost anything if you're a local that lives here year round. If you're a tourist that wants to go look at t-shirts that say Whitefish, Montana, and that sort of thing, there's plenty of for you to do here in town. But not having that little neighborhood commercial, whether it's coffee shop, bakery, whatever. The bagel shop here is great, and that's like a perfect neighborhood commercial example, but more of that would be good.
So number 5 is that public infrastructure investments must focus on where people struggle to use the city as built. So right now we focus a lot of our time and money and energy as a city on new developments and infrastructure to support those new developments on the edge of town. Obviously, that is incredibly challenging on the city's long-term financial future, and it also doesn't serve the people who are actually in the community. And the last principle, 6 out of 6, is maintaining a sense of urgency. So I pulled out one of my favorite quotes here that I think a lot of people in this valley could learn from. Don't form a formal committee. Don't hire a consultant. Don't pause 18 months while a grant application is processed. Once a struggle has been humbly observed and the next smallest thing to be done identified, go out and do that thing. Make things better right now.
And we hear all the time, is in whitefish particularly, how whitefish is different. So like none of these things that have been tried in other places will work. And that may be the case, that may not be the case. But yeah, that this really kind of hits at that. It's the idea of executing and then studying, or implementing a policy change and then studying it, see how it actually works on the ground in your community versus studying and then implementing, or more likely never implementing a policy change. And so if we really want to make these things better, we really kind of just have to go for it and assess it frequently down the line and see if it's actually hitting the goals that we want. And if it's not, we can change things.
I think implementing these strategies, one of the key ways in which that's identified is encouraging incremental development. So not only in terms of the types of housing we have, but the people who are doing the development. Having more people that live in the community, able to take on like small projects and have those grow over time into really like improving a community. And that's a like pattern of development that isn't very common because of the regulatory framework that we've implemented. But again, one theme of this book and of this conversation is that that's very new. That's a 1, 2, 3 generation paradigm where zoning, financing, and building housing is an incredibly professionalized industry. There's some elements of that professionalization that are good, but what it also has done is destroyed the ability for many housing types to be built in our neighborhoods.
And if you're somebody that wants to help out your own community or kind of build your neighborhood to be a place that is more inclusive and welcoming and has more affordable housing for people to get into, then being an incremental developer is like really how you personally kind of get into that. You don't need as much capital to do this. The big developers aren't going to do it because they just have a model, and they're not going to try to build 100 fourplexes on various lots throughout a city. They're just going to build 300 single family homes in a subdivision. It's much easier to do. So we need a lot of people that kind of want to make a difference here, that have maybe equity in their home. And that is the idea of an incremental developer. And that's something at Livable Flathead that we're working on right now, actually, is kind of putting a guide for homeowners together that would walk them through the process of doing this, because there's a lot of different agencies and a lot of different things that you need to know that can kind of derail a project. And so we want to try to consolidate that all into one spot so people can really get a feel for whether or not they can do this. We'll bring in the Incremental Development Alliance, hopefully, to do a workshop or two here to help people feel even more confident with it. And that is kind of the strong towns theory of change, I guess. In a nutshell, is really like people using land they already own in their own neighborhoods, putting an ADU on it, converting their house to a duplex, and demolishing the 150-year-old house that is barely standing anymore and building a fourplex instead, that sort of thing.
Anything else you have to say about the book?
It's a pretty quick read, though, so definitely look at picking it up. And yeah, thanks for having me.